In the winter of 1947, Europe did not rebuild, it starved. There were no Marshall Plan shipments stacked in busy ports, no rail convoys distributing grain steel or dollar-financed hope. Instead, the continent existed in a static, frozen despair cities intact from the war, but hollowed by its victory. The Reich had not lasted another decade, but it had not needed to. Its economists had achieved what its generals could not. Berlin had collapsed in 1945, yes, but the world collapsed with it in 1946. Picture it. London. Ration lines not shrinking with peace, but doubled. Pound notes printed by the billion worth less each morning. Parliament shouting over inflation figures that looked like tide surges, unstoppable, exponential. Britain had won the battlefield but lost the balance sheet. Washington. The city of new empire, suddenly an empire of paper. Its gold drained credit untrusted. The dollar, once the spine of global commerce, slipping into paralysis. Nations that once begged for loans now refused repayment in dollars at all. The world no longer priced oil in American currency. Confidence more powerful than any army had fractured. And in Buenos Aires, Ankara, Lisbon, Bangkok capitals far from the war's smoke, the telegrams arrived. Markets suspended, currencies failing, trade collapsing. This was the moment no bomb could achieve, no tank, no invasion, no Luftwaffe campaign. This was arithmetic, because while history remembers Stalingrad, Normandy, and Berlin, there was another front, one without trenches or artillery, one fought with clearinghouses, credit flows, gold strategies, bilateral trade traps, and something far more fragile than armor: confidence. While Hitler demanded maps, his financial architects demanded ledgers. They asked a different question. What if the Reich doesn't need to conquer the world, only bankrupt it? What if victory is not territorial but systemic? Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, Walter Funk, Hermann Abs, the architects of an invisible war. They devised an economic siege no navy could blockade. A system of engineered imbalances locked markets, foreign currency starvation, and controlled credit addiction that forced nations into irreversible dependency. It was not merely economics, it was economic gravity. No matter who won on the ground, their model predicted the same outcome. If the Allies bled enough capital to win the war, their victory liabilities would kill them in peace. Win the battle, lose the system. The Reich calculated its defeat could still become the world's default if the financial war was structured correctly. And for a brief chilling moment in alternative history, it worked. This video is not about medals or generals. It's about central banks and invisible weapons. About the leverage of debt being stronger than steel. About collapses that look sudden, but are engineered slowly, quietly, mathematically. Because nations don't just fall when armies break. They fall when the numbers do. And in this timeline built not on gunfire but credit fire, the Axis did not win the world. It broke the world's engine. What followed was not occupation, but something far harder to defeat. Irrelevance, insolvency, implosion. This is the story of the war after the war. The war the victors didn't know they were losing. The war written not in history books, but in balance sheets. Money is a weapon, but unlike bullets, you never hear it fire. The core of the Reich's financial doctrine was brutally simple. Do not destroy your opponent's production. Destroy their ability to finance existence. Empires do not collapse when they lose resources. They collapse when their currency stops representing reality. Schacht. The earliest architect understood a truth. Modern economists still tiptoe around. A nation can survive shortages. It cannot survive the death of trust. So while Allied factories flooded the world with tanks and bombers, the Reich designed a different arsenal. A trade empire without free trade. A currency shielded from true markets. Bilateral agreements that drained foreign reserves. And most important, the creation of dependency masquerading as partnership. Imagine a dam holding back 100 rivers. As long as the wall stands, everything feels stable, quiet, predictable, managed. But the danger is never the final crack. It is the pressure you didn't notice building behind the concrete. The Nazi economists didn't believe in chasing economic growth in the traditional sense. Growth was a luxury of peaceful nations. Their system pursued controlled distortion rather than expansion. They weaponized 3 pillars. 1. Currency isolation. The Reichsmark was shielded from global markets, disconnected from natural price discovery. It was a valve system, not a currency. Capital could enter the Reich, but it could not exit freely. Like a mirror that reflects only one direction, global markets could see Germany. Germany could not be financially influenced in return. 2. Engineered credit addiction. Through Hjalmar Schacht's new plan and later the MIFO bills system, Germany paid for rearmament using controlled phantom credit finance that behaved like debt but evaporated when inspected. The Reich built an arsenal without traditional borrowing, forcing other nations to finance warfare while believing Germany was the debtor, not the designer. 3. Trade without escape. Through bilateral clearing agreements, the economic equivalent of locked doors, Germany structured partnerships where foreign exports were paid not in convertible currency, but in credits only redeemable inside the Reich economy. Eastern and Southern Europe shipped grain fuel and raw materials, but were paid in a currency they could spend only in German-controlled markets. It was economic magnetism. Resources flowed inward. Capital never flowed outward. Dependence deepened. Competition fossilized. Now consider collapse not as an explosion, but a trapdoor. Most financial failures feel like earthquakes, tremors, then ruin. But systemic collapse is different. It feels like standing still until the ground politely steps away from your feet. When currency eclipses goods, when promises outnumber production, when credit outgrows credibility, collapse is not a shock. It is an equation resolving itself. And that was the genius and the terror of the Reich's financial doctrine. They were not trying to outproduce the world. They were trying to outmath the world. If victory demands infinite spending and peace demands infinite rebuilding, then the nation that wins the war with credit is not the one who wins history. It is the one who survives the bill. And in this scenario, the Allies win the war, but the Reich writes the invoice. In 1918, the British Empire was not defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated by the bill that arrived after. At the end of the First World War, Britain still possessed the largest navy on Earth. Its flag still crowned global sea routes. It still technically controlled a quarter of the world's land. By all visible measures, guns, territory, prestige, it should have remained unshakable. But beneath the uniform victory parades, the numbers were whispering something entirely different. To win the war, Britain had spent more than double its national GDP. It liquidated foreign investments. It drained gold reserves. It borrowed from its future and then borrowed against the borrowing itself. By 1919, Britain transitioned from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. For a century, the globe had run on sterling. Now sterling was running on hope. The pound did not collapse overnight. Empires rarely see the moment they truly fall. They only notice when gravity stops holding things in place. The first crack was invisible to the public. It appeared in the ledgers of central banks. Foreign governments began trading in dollars instead of pounds, not as a revolution, but as a convenience. The pound still functioned. It was still strong. But global finance is not a popularity contest. It is a threshold game. And once a currency loses necessity, it quietly loses supremacy. The second crack came through confidence. By the 1930s, Britain could no longer guarantee convertibility of sterling into gold. It made the announcement gently, bureaucratically, almost politely, but the meaning was unmistakable. The empire could no longer cash the checks it had written to win history. Then came the human echoes of decline. Factories slowed. Wages decoupled from prices. Rationing arrived years before the Second World War even began. Entire industries limped not from destruction, but from liquidity starvation. This is the key principle the Reich economists studied with religious intensity. Britain had not lost territory first. Britain had lost financial sovereignty first. Because when currency strength evaporates, militaries become liabilities, not assets. Infrastructure becomes expense, not power. Colonies become maintenance costs instead of profit engines. Influence becomes theater, not leverage. By 1945, the transition was undeniable. The British Empire had not been conquered, it had been out-financed. The United States did not seize global leadership through invasion. It inherited it through liquidity. This was the pattern the Reich believed the Allies would repeat, but faster, deeper, and without an American lifeline waiting in reserve. The lesson was ruthless. A nation can be feared militarily and irrelevant financially at the same time. It can win wars and still lose the century. Because armies defend borders, currencies defend the future. One can be rebuilt with factories, the other requires belief. And belief once broken is harder to reconstruct than any shattered capital city. The British collapse was slow, structural, dignified, bureaucratic, almost gentle. But 2 empires later learned that decline does not always arrive with politeness. It can arrive like panic. Consider the fall of the Weimar Mark. Germany, 1923. A defeated nation, drowning in reparations, had no choice but to print, borrow, and print again. At first, inflation was an inconvenience, then a crisis, then a force of nature. Money once a tool became a weather event. Workers were paid twice a day because by evening wages were obsolete. Savings evaporated not over years but over hours. Families stopped measuring wealth in currency. They measured it in bread, coal, soap, and train tickets. Barter replaced banking. Wheelbarrows replaced wallets. This was not an economy failing, it was an economy forgetting the meaning of money. In the span of weeks, a world built on numbers disconnected from numbers. The psychological contract of currency, the shared hallucination that paper holds value, was broken. A teacher's lifetime savings could not pay for a lunch. That is currency death in its purest form. And yet Weimar was chaotic, uncontrolled, desperate. It was collapsed by fire. Now contrast it with the fall of the Soviet economy collapsed by ice. The USSR did not implode through hyperinflation. It collapsed through glaciation, a currency technically stable, yet spiritually irrelevant. By the 1980s, the ruble still existed. Prices remained officially frozen. The state claimed stability. But the economy beneath had withdrawn from reality entirely. You could have money and nothing to buy. You could have wages and no goods to match them. You could have a job and nothing to produce. The ruble functioned on paper, but society functioned around it. Cigarettes became currency, vodka became currency, favors became currency. Against all logic, the USSR was both liquid and insolvent at the same time. Not broke, not functional, just hollow. One empire collapsed because money multiplied until it meant nothing. The other collapsed because money existed but meant nothing. Different diseases, same diagnosis. A currency dies not when governments announce it, but when the public internally repeals it. And when that happens, the state has already lost even if the flag still stands. Now stitch the pattern together. Britain lost financial primacy after winning the war. Weimar lost reality because currency outran production. The USSR lost relevance because production detached from currency. Each collapse looked unique in the moment. In hindsight, they were the same story with different costumes. Victory without solvency, money without meaning, state power without economic gravity. Empires don't vanish when they look weak. They vanish when their systems stop being believed. And that was exactly the vulnerability the Reich economists planned to weaponize. Not by defeating armies, but by defeating assumptions about money itself. Every great economic collapse is chaotic on the surface but mechanical underneath. Strip away the politics, the headlines, the panic, the personalities, and what remains is a repeating architecture. Not random, not mysterious. Engineered by incentives, debt gravity, and human psychology, responding to pressure like predictable particles in physics. The Reich economists believed they had mapped that architecture, not as a theory, as an inevitability. Their model was not drawn like a manifesto. It behaved like falling dominoes arranged by mathematics, not ideology. Each stage created the conditions for the next accelerating, not by intention, but by consequence. It began quietly always. A state spends more power than it produces. At first, the imbalance is invisible, hidden inside confidence. Credit replaces industry. Loans replace results. The difference between paper strength and real strength begins to separate like train tracks, slowly diverging, imperceptible at first, impossible to ignore later. Then comes substitution. Currency stops representing production and starts representing belief. That belief must be fed continuously like a flame that consumes progressively more fuel to stay the same size. Central banks don't stabilize the system, they become the system. After that, leverage mutates. Debt is no longer a tool, it is infrastructure. The economy cannot slow without collapsing, so it accelerates not toward growth, but to outrun gravity. Survival becomes velocity. Then arrives the critical transformation dependency. The nation no longer finances itself, it refinances itself. Obligations are extended, stacked, rolled, relabeled, securitized, institutionalized. The question stops being, can we pay this back, and becomes, can we delay paying this back for longer than others expect? At this point, the architecture changes from economics to psychology, because the engine is no longer industry or trade or productivity. It is credibility. Then the mirror cracks. Foreign actors, markets, trade partners, anyone with exposure to the system quietly begins hedging against it. Not through revolt, but through avoidance. They diversify reserves, reroute trade, price commodities in alternatives. Nothing dramatic happens until it does. Because collapse is never the moment everyone panics. It is the moment everyone quietly prepares to not need you anymore. That transition triggers the cascade. Liquidity tightens. Demand for currency slows. Debt that depended on infinite refinancing suddenly needs real settlement. The system built to expand forever discovers it no longer has the luxury of time. And only then comes the event historians mistake for the cause. A bank falters. A bond auction fails. A currency drops through a psychological flaw. A trade partner refuses settlement in your unit of account. A rumor moves faster than your central bank can counter it. That moment feels like the beginning. It is the end, because the real collapse happened earlier silently when the system crossed the point where it needed more trust than the world was able to generate. The Reich did not believe the Axis needed to defeat the Allies militarily to win this cycle. They believed the war itself would push the Allied economies into the funnel, into a structure where victory costs more than defeat and peace costs more than war, where winning the conflict meant losing the century. Not by mistake, by equation. Now take that model and lay it over the world of 1945. At first glance, the Allies looked untouchable. Germany was ashes. Japan shattered. The American industrial machine had produced more steel than every Axis nation combined. The dollar was ascendant gold reserves overflowing global military reach unchallenged. But the Reich economists had never built their strategy on battlefield outcomes. They built it on post-war liabilities. Their belief was simple, brutal, and almost elegant. The Axis cannot outproduce the Allies, but the Allies might outspend themselves trying to win. Total war is not paid for during war, it is paid for after. And in their calculations, the bill was the weapon. Consider the Allied position in 1945 through their lens. The United Kingdom financially exhausted empire overstretched reserves, drained borrowing from the US to stay solvent even before victory speeches dried. France, victorious in name, but economically paralyzed its currency, destabilized by occupation reconstruction, demands towering like mountains of unpaid invoices. The Soviet Union, militarily triumphant, yet economically cratered 27 million dead industrial regions, scorched solvency dependent on centralized coercion rather than recoverable capital. And the United States apparently unshaken but supporting the weight of the entire coalition through Lend-Lease grants, reconstruction funding, humanitarian imports, and foreign credit lines that would never be fully repaid. Victory forged dependency. Dependency forged leverage. Leverage forged vulnerability. Now imagine the divergence point in the alternate timeline. There's no Marshall Plan. No ocean of dollar liquidity rebuilding Europe. No reserve currency consensus forming around the USD. No Bretton Woods architecture stabilizing exchange rates. No IMF backstopping national insolvency. No World Bank rebuilding bridges, ports, grids, or treasuries. Not because the US refuses, but because it cannot afford to. In this version of history, the United States finished the war victorious but not solvent. Its gold reserves depleted not by military loss, but by financing the victory itself and sustaining global supply lines that vastly exceeded national income. Without the ability to export capital, the dollar never becomes the gravitational center. And without a gravitational center, no global recovery system forms. Europe rebuilds slowly bilaterally, transaction by transaction, draining reserves instead of replenishing them. Barter and regional credit blocks replace liquid markets. Currencies contract into survival mode. International trade fractures into localized clearing systems, uncannily similar to the ones the Reich had pioneered. And here is the grim symmetry. The very architecture designed by the Third Reich to survive financial isolation trade silos, managed currencies, non-convertible settlement, bilateral clearing, becomes the default global structure not by imposition, but by necessity. Not through German victory, but through Allied exhaustion. In this scenario, Berlin falls, but globalization falls with it. Allied economies break not because they lose, but because they won a war their balance sheets were not built to carry. And in the vacuum left behind, the world does not reorganize around freedom or fascism. It reorganizes around liquidity. Who has it? Who doesn't? And who controls the pipes it flows through? That was the Reich's true theory of victory. Not flags, not borders, not armored divisions, but the shape of the post-war financial order. A war after the war. Invisible, unforgiving, already underway. And now the scenario accelerates toward fracture. If the Allies cannot stabilize the post-war financial world, the triggers are no longer military. They are mechanical, small shocks hitting a system that has no shock absorbers left. The first trigger is currency dislocation. In 1946, Britain attempts a pound-dollar convertibility window to restore trade confidence. In actual history, it failed in weeks. In this alternate world, it fails in days. The Bank of England halts conversions entirely. Markets interpret it not as policy, but surrender. The pound drops into freefall on the black market. Other nations, fearing contagion, impose capital controls within 72 hours. What was once the global currency pyramid becomes a constellation of isolated financial fiefdoms. Trigger 2, the balance of payments spiral. With the US unable to provide reconstruction credit, Europe must pay for imports food, coal machinery with gold it no longer possesses. Nations that cannot import cannot restart factories. Nations that cannot restart factories cannot export. The trade loop snaps like an over-tightened cable. Ports fill with ships carrying goods no nation can afford to unload. Trigger 3, sovereign default dominoes. France misses external payments first. Italy follows. Then Britain itself quietly restructures wartime debt into instruments the market sees as symbolic rather than solvent. By 1947, sovereign debt is no longer priced on ability to pay, it is priced on risk of disorder. At this point, capital does not merely flee Europe, it disappears from Europe as a concept. Trigger 4, the commodity substitution revolt. With currencies distrusted, vital goods reprice themselves outside money. Oil contracts reference barrels, not pounds or dollars. Grain futures settle in physical delivery, not payment. Coal is allocated by treaty, not purchase. Money has not vanished, it has just lost primacy. Trigger 5, the psychological break. This is not an economic event, it is a cultural one. The moment the average citizen no longer asks, is the price higher today, but instead asks, will money work here at all tomorrow? When that question goes mainstream, the timeline collapses into weeks. Governments respond the only way strained systems ever respond, by printing. But printing does not restore trust. It accelerates the moment when everyone realizes trust is gone. And then comes contagion velocity. Inflation does not rise in percentages, it rises in waves. Trade does not shrink gradually, it fractures along political fault lines. Governments do not collapse by coup or invasion. They collapse by administrative irrelevance. Every hour introduces a new higher gear of instability. Markets open to panic, close to prevent panic, reopen to worse panic. Rationing begins for goods shifts to fuel mutates into money itself. Alliances renegotiate not borders but access to solvency. Economies bifurcate into producers and dependents, creditors and supplicants. The cascade has no villain, no single detonator, no dramatic drag the statue moment. It has something more unnerving. Momentum. The world is not watching a collapse anymore. It is trying to keep up with one, and in that moment the greatest currency is no longer the dollar, the pound or gold. It is optionality, the ability to survive when systems stop offering solutions and start demanding sacrifices. When financial systems fail at scale, the worst damage is not economic. It is human. Currencies collapsing bonds, defaulting central banks, improvising, these are symptoms. The real cost is what happens when the invisible scaffolding supporting daily life evaporates. In this alternate 1947, the front lines are grocery queues, train platforms, hospitals, and harvested fields. Not because armies occupy them, but because logistics can no longer afford to reach them. Food is no longer priced by farmers or markets. It is priced by proximity, season, and desperation. Cities fracture into zones of availability, districts that eat, districts that wait, districts that gamble on tomorrow. Governments issue rations not as policy, but triage. Calories become geopolitics. Medicine follows the same fate. Not due to a lack of knowledge, penicillin exists, vaccines exist, but because chemistry requires supply chains, and supply chains require credit, and credit requires trust. When trust died, so did distribution. And beneath it all, the least visible casualty spreads fastest. Social contract failure. People do not riot first, they improvise first. They trade favors before money. They barter before they revolt. They solve locally before they blame nationally. Collapse is quiet until it isn't. The pivot from endurance to rupture happens in a different place every time, but it always shares a signature moment. The day ordinary citizens stop asking governments for rescue and start asking neighbors for protection. Not ideology, not anger, just arithmetic at street level. Now the hardest question, could any of this have been stopped? Not fully. Once a global financial engine passes its saturation point, where liabilities exceed collective belief, stabilization is no longer economic. It becomes political, psychological, and occasionally coercive. The Reich's economists understood something rarely spoken aloud by their counterparts in democratic capitals. Systems do not collapse when they are poor. They collapse when they must grow forever to avoid dying. An economy forced to expand indefinitely is not a system. It is a countdown. The Allies in this alternate world were not defeated by strategy or sabotage. They were defeated by the same structure that defeated Britain after 1918, Weimar after 1923, the USSR after 1989, and every dominant power that believed victory rewrote mathematics. Empires don't fail for lack of strength. They fail for lack of runtime. So here is the brutal symmetry of this timeline. Hitler still loses the war. The Reich still falls. The ideology still perishes in fire and ruin. But its final weapon, financial exhaustion, survives it. Not by triumph, by contagion. Not by occupation, by inheritance. Because collapse does not ask who deserved to win. It only asks who can remain standing when the bill arrives. And if there is one law that governs every empire, every currency, every system built on human confidence, it is this. Empires don't die from invasion, they die from mathematics. Slow, until suddenly. If you want to understand how power truly works, not the visible power of armies and elections, but the invisible architecture of credit leverage and control, then subscribe. Because the most decisive wars in history were not fought on land, sea, or air. They were fought in ledgers. And the next one already is